Sometimes the most dangerous secret isn't betrayal. It's the truth someone is dying to hide. The first drop landed on the back of Damien Moretti's hand before he even understood what he was looking at. For a brief second, time seemed to stop inside the private conference room on the 42nd floor of Moretti Tower. Conversations died. The soft hum of the city beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows faded into silence. Even the rain tapping against the glass seemed distant. Damien stared at the dark red stain against his skin. His mind refused to connect it to reality. Across from him, Ethan Carter lowered his hand from his mouth. His face had gone pale. Too pale. The color had drained from his cheeks so completely that he looked like a ghost standing beneath the bright white lights of the room. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Ethan's fingers trembled slightly as he folded a white handkerchief over his lips. When he pulled it away, Damien saw the evidence. More red. More than enough to erase every explanation he had spent months building in his head. "Ethan," Damien said quietly. It was the first time all evening his voice had lost its usual certainty. Ethan didn't answer. His silver-blue eyes remained fixed on the floor. Damien rose from his chair immediately. The movement sent every person in the room into nervous silence. Men who feared Damien Moretti more than they feared the police suddenly found themselves staring at the Omega standing near the conference table. Ethan swayed slightly, just enough for Damien to notice. Just enough to make something cold settle deep inside his chest. 3 months. For 3 months Damien had been convinced Ethan was hiding something from him. Secret phone calls. Unexplained absences. Appointments he refused to discuss. Bills paid in cash. Locked drawers. Half-finished conversations that stopped the moment Damien entered a room. None of it had made sense. Ethan had never been dishonest. That was one of the first things Damien had admired about him. Ethan spoke carefully, thoughtfully, sometimes too honestly for his own good. Yet over the last few months, every instinct Damien possessed had been screaming that something was wrong. At first he assumed someone was threatening Ethan. Then he suspected blackmail. Later he considered the possibility that a rival organization had somehow reached him. None of those theories lasted long. Every lead collapsed into nothing. Every answer created more questions. Meanwhile, Ethan kept smiling, kept insisting everything was fine, kept pretending the shadows beneath his eyes weren't growing darker every week. Damien had noticed all of it. The exhaustion, the weight loss, the way Ethan occasionally pressed a hand against his ribs when he thought nobody was looking. But Ethan always had an explanation. Stress, lack of sleep, too much coffee. Damien wanted to believe him. Instead, suspicion had taken root. And suspicion was a dangerous thing, especially for a man like Damien Moretti. The room remained silent as Ethan slowly folded the stained handkerchief and slipped it into his pocket. "I'm okay," Ethan said softly. Damien almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was impossible. The words sounded absurd standing beside the evidence still visible on Damien's hand. "You're okay?" Damien repeated. Ethan finally looked up. His eyes met Damien's. For a fraction of a second, Damien saw something there he had never seen before. Not fear, not guilt, resignation. The kind of resignation people carried when they had been fighting a battle for a very long time and were beginning to lose. Ethan attempted a small smile. It broke Damien's heart more than any confession ever could. "I'm fine," Ethan whispered. Damien stared at him, then at the handkerchief hidden inside his pocket. Then back at Ethan. Every theory, every accusation, every suspicion he had carried for months suddenly felt fragile, incomplete, wrong. Outside, thunder rolled across the city skyline. Inside the room, nobody dared speak. Because for the first time in months, Damien realized the secret Ethan had been hiding might not be what he thought at all. And the terrifying part was that he no longer knew which answer scared him more. 3 months earlier, Damien Moretti had not been looking for secrets. He had been looking for peace. That alone should have warned him something was wrong. Peace never lasted long in his world. The city stretched beneath the windows of his penthouse like a sea of lights, endless and restless. But inside the apartment, everything felt unusually quiet. Ethan sat curled into the corner of the couch with a book balanced on his knee and a cup of tea cooling beside him. The soft amber glow of the lamp painted warm shadows across his face. It was an ordinary evening, the kind Damien secretly treasured because nobody demanded anything from him. No meetings, no negotiations, no emergencies. Just Ethan, Yet that was the night Damien noticed the first crack. Ethan's phone vibrated. Once, then twice. Damien barely paid attention until Ethan glanced at the screen. The change was immediate. The relaxed expression vanished. A brief flicker of tension crossed his features before he quickly stood. "I need some air," Ethan said. Damien frowned. "At 11:30? Ethan offered a small smile. "I will only be a few minutes." Damien watched him disappear onto the balcony. Through the glass doors, he could see Ethan speaking quietly into the phone. The conversation lasted less than 60 seconds. When Ethan returned, he seemed perfectly calm. Too calm. Damien almost asked about it, but decided against it. Everyone deserved privacy, including Ethan. The next incident happened 2 weeks later. Damien arrived home early after a canceled meeting. The apartment was empty. That alone was unusual. Ethan always left a note if he planned to be gone. Damien checked the kitchen counter. Nothing. The dining table. Nothing. An hour passed before Ethan returned carrying a paper shopping bag. "Where were you?" Damien asked. Ethan froze for a fraction of a second. "Running errands." "For 4 hours?" Ethan looked away. Traffic was terrible. It was not a convincing lie. Damien knew it. Ethan knew it. Yet the conversation ended there. After that, the strange moments began multiplying. Ethan started leaving the apartment several times a week. Sometimes early in the morning, sometimes late at night. He kept folders inside locked drawers. He paid certain bills with cash despite never using cash before. More than once Damien entered a room and found Ethan quickly closing a laptop screen. None of it fit together. The pieces formed a puzzle without an image. One evening Damien finally decided to ask directly. They were eating dinner in a small Italian restaurant overlooking the river. Soft music drifted through the room. Candlelight reflected against the water outside. It should have been a perfect night. "Are you in trouble?" Damien asked suddenly. Ethan blinked. "What?" "Someone is asking you for money." "No, someone is threatening you." "No." "Then explain the secrets." Ethan stared down at his untouched pasta. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he smiled. Not the genuine smile Damien loved. A smaller one. Fragile somehow. "You worry too much." Damien leaned back in his chair. "That is not an answer." Ethan reached across the table and squeezed his hand. His fingers felt colder than usual. "Trust me." Damien wanted to. More than anything, he wanted to trust him. Yet later that night, long after Ethan had fallen asleep, Damien stood alone in the dark apartment replaying every strange detail from the last several months. The phone calls, the disappearances, the lies. For the first time, a thought entered his mind and refused to leave. Ethan was hiding something, and whatever it was becoming bigger than either of them. Ethan Carter had become an expert at pretending. He pretended the headaches were manageable. He pretended the exhaustion was temporary. He pretended the dizziness that occasionally blurred his vision was nothing more than stress. Most importantly, he pretended Damien Moretti did not notice any of it. The truth was far less comforting. Every morning began the same way. Ethan would wake before sunrise, long before the city stirred to life. The apartment remained silent except for the distant hum of traffic 40 stories below. Those quiet hours had become his refuge, his opportunity to hide the symptoms before anyone could see them. He sat on the edge of the bed one morning, waiting for the room to stop spinning. His chest felt tight. Not painful exactly, just heavy, as though something invisible rested against his ribs. Beside him, Damien slept peacefully. Ethan watched him for a moment and felt a familiar ache settle in his heart. Damien looked younger when he slept. Less burdened, less dangerous. The sharp edges of responsibility disappeared. Ethan wished he could preserve that version of him forever. Instead, he stood carefully and slipped into the bathroom. The coughing started the moment he locked the door. He grabbed the edge of the sink and waited for it to pass. His reflection stared back from the mirror. Pale skin, tired eyes, weight loss that no amount of oversized sweaters could fully conceal anymore. When the coughing finally stopped, he opened the medicine cabinet. A small orange prescription bottle waited behind several ordinary containers. Ethan stared at it without touching it. Then he closed the cabinet again. The medication was not helping as much as it used to. That realization frightened him more than anything. Later that afternoon, he sat inside a specialist's office on the opposite side of the city. Rain streaked down the windows while a gray-haired doctor reviewed charts in silence. Ethan already knew what the conversation would be. He could see it in the man's eyes. "How have the symptoms been?" the doctor asked gently. Ethan forced a smile. "About the same." The doctor looked unconvinced. "And the coughing?" Ethan hesitated. "More frequent." Another pause followed. The doctor removed his glasses and folded them carefully on the desk. "You need to tell someone." Ethan stared at the floor. "No, Ethan." No, his answer came faster this time. "Stronger." The doctor sighed. "You cannot keep carrying this alone." Ethan laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "You do not know Damien. Then help me understand." Ethan looked toward the rain-soaked window. "If he finds out, he will stop everything. Perhaps that is not a bad thing. You do not understand." Ethan's voice lowered. "He spends every day protecting everyone around him. He carries responsibilities that never end. If he learns this," Ethan swallowed hard, "he will make my illness his entire world." The doctor remained silent. Ethan continued staring at the storm outside. "I do not want that." What he did not say was even simpler. He was terrified. Terrified of becoming a burden. Terrified of seeing pity replace love in Damien's eyes. Terrified that speaking the truth would somehow make everything real. When the appointment ended, Ethan left through a side entrance and pulled his coat tighter against the cold wind. He never noticed the black SUV parked across the street. He never noticed the man sitting behind the wheel. And he certainly never noticed the camera quietly capturing photographs as he walked away from the clinic. Because while Ethan had spent months hiding the truth from Damien, Damien had finally decided to stop asking questions and start looking for answers himself. Damien Moretti rarely trusted other people with important tasks. Trust was expensive. Trust was dangerous. Trust often became a liability. Yet by the end of that week, a small team of investigators had quietly begun following Ethan's movements throughout the city. Damien justified it to himself as concern. Nothing more. If Ethan was in trouble, Damien needed to know. If someone was manipulating him, Damien needed proof. If there was a threat hiding somewhere beyond his reach, he intended to find it. The first reports only deepened the mystery. Ethan was not meeting with rivals. He was not transferring money to suspicious accounts. He was not speaking with strangers in hidden locations. In fact, his routine seemed almost painfully ordinary. He visited bookstores, small coffee shops, public parks, a local animal shelter where he occasionally volunteered. None of it explained the secrets. None of it explained the lies. Then the photographs arrived. Damien studied them late one evening in his office. Ethan entering a medical building. Ethan leaving the same building 2 hours later. Ethan sitting alone on a bench outside while staring at the ground. Ethan returning a week later. Then again, and again. Damien's jaw tightened. Medical appointments. Multiple appointments. Yet Ethan had never mentioned any health concerns. Not once. The discovery should have relieved him. Instead, it made him uneasy. Something about the images felt wrong. Ethan looked smaller in them. Tired. There was a loneliness in his posture that Damien could not ignore. A loneliness he had somehow failed to see while living under the same roof. The next morning, Damien attempted a different approach. He found Ethan in the kitchen making coffee. Sunlight streamed through the windows. For a moment, everything looked normal. Peaceful. Ethan smiled when he noticed him. "Good morning." Damien walked over and kissed the top of his head. "Good morning." Ethan handed him a mug. "You have an early meeting today. It can wait." Ethan looked surprised. Damien watched him carefully. "How are you feeling?" Ethan blinked. "Fine." There it was again. The same answer. The same automatic response. Damien forced himself to remain calm. "Are you sure?" "Of course." Ethan laughed softly. "Why are you asking?" Damien considered telling him about the photographs. About the clinic. About the months of unanswered questions. Instead, he shook his head. No reason. Ethan seemed relieved. The reaction lasted less than a second, but Damien noticed it. That frightened him more than anything. Because innocent people did not look relieved when difficult questions disappeared. Over the next several weeks, the pattern continued. Ethan kept leaving for appointments. Damien kept receiving reports. The investigators managed to identify the building, but not the reason for the visits. Medical privacy laws prevented access to records. The doctors refused to discuss patients. Every door Damien approached remained closed. For the first time in years, money and influence failed to provide answers. Frustration began replacing concern. Concern became suspicion. Suspicion became obsession. One rainy Friday evening, the tension finally surfaced. Ethan returned home nearly 3 hours later than expected. His coat was damp from the weather. His face looked exhausted. Damien was waiting in the living room. Neither spoke immediately. The silence stretched between them. "Where were you?" Damien asked. Ethan set down his keys. "Out." "Doing what?" "Running errands." Damien stared at him. "Still lying?" Ethan froze. The color drained slightly from his face. "What are you talking about?" Damien stood slowly. "That is exactly what I am trying to figure out." Ethan looked away first. And in that single moment, Damien became more certain than ever that a secret existed between them. What he did not realize was that the truth waiting behind that secret was far more heartbreaking than anything he had imagined. The argument began quietly. That was what made it worse. Ethan stood near the kitchen island, avoiding Damien's gaze while pretending to organize a stack of unopened mail. Outside, rain slid down the windows in silver streaks, turning the city beyond into a blur of distant lights. Damien remained across the room, his patience wearing thinner with every passing second. "How long?" he finally asked. Ethan did not look up. "How long what? How long have you been lying to me?" The words hung between them. Heavy. Unavoidable. Ethan placed the envelopes down carefully. "I am not lying." Damien laughed once, a short sound without humor. "Then tell me where you go every week." Silence. "Tell me why you keep disappearing." More silence. "Tell me why you have appointments you never mention." Ethan's head snapped upward. For the first time, genuine alarm crossed his face. Damien immediately noticed it. The reaction confirmed everything. "You followed me?" Ethan asked quietly. "I tried asking first." "You followed me because you would not tell me the truth." Ethan looked away. The disappointment in his expression hurt more than Damien expected. Yet frustration had carried him too far to stop now. For months he had worried. For months he had imagined threats hiding around every corner. Now he finally had proof that something was wrong, and Ethan still refused to explain. "What exactly are you hiding?" Damien asked. Ethan folded his arms across his chest. "Nothing." "Stop saying that. It is the truth." "No." Damien took a step forward. "The truth is that every time I ask a simple question, you find a way to avoid answering." Ethan's shoulders tensed. "Maybe because some things are private." "Private?" Damien repeated. "You vanish for hours. You lie about where you have been. You keep secrets and expect me not to notice." Ethan's eyes flashed with sudden anger. "Not everything is about you, Damien." The room fell silent. Damien stared at him. Ethan immediately looked as though he regretted the words, but they had already landed. For several seconds, neither spoke. Rain continued tapping against the glass. Somewhere below, a siren echoed through the city streets. "That is what you think?" Damien asked quietly. "That this is about me?" Ethan rubbed a hand across his face. He looked exhausted. More exhausted than angry. "I think you are trying to solve a problem that is not yours to solve." Damien shook his head. "If it affects you, then it affects me." Ethan laughed softly. The sound carried an edge of sadness. "That is exactly why I cannot tell you." Damien frowned. "Cannot?" "Yes." Ethan's voice dropped. "Cannot." For a brief moment, Damien saw something break through Ethan's carefully constructed calm. Fear. Not guilt. Not shame. Fear. Then it vanished again. "Trust me," Ethan whispered. Damien closed his eyes. Those two words had once been enough. Now they felt like a wall standing between them. "I am trying," he admitted. "But you are making it impossible." Ethan swallowed hard. His eyes looked suspiciously bright beneath the apartment lights. "I am sorry." Damien waited. He expected an explanation to follow. A confession. Anything. Instead, Ethan simply stood there. Silent. The apology was all he offered. Minutes later, he grabbed his coat and headed toward the door. Damien watched him leave without stopping him. The apartment felt colder after it closed behind him. Neither of them realized it would be the last normal conversation they would have before everything changed. The annual leadership meeting was supposed to be routine. Representatives from every branch of the organization had gathered inside the executive conference room of Moretti Tower. The atmosphere was formal, controlled, and quiet. Damien sat at the head of the table reviewing reports while senior advisors discussed quarterly projections and upcoming projects. Normally, Ethan never attended these meetings. He disliked the attention and preferred staying far from business matters whenever possible. But after their argument 3 days earlier, Damien had been surprised when Ethan agreed to join him for lunch afterward. It felt like a peace offering, a chance to repair the distance growing between them. At least, that was what Damien had hoped. Ethan arrived 20 minutes before noon. The moment he entered the room, Damien noticed something was wrong. His smile appeared forced. His movements seemed slower than usual. Dark circles lingered beneath his eyes despite his attempt to hide them. Several times during the presentation, Ethan shifted in his seat, as though struggling to stay comfortable. Damien watched him closely. Concern returned immediately. Whatever secret Ethan carried, it was clearly taking a toll. Twice Damien considered ending the meeting early. Twice Ethan gave him a reassuring smile that seemed to say everything was fine. The smile did not reach his eyes. By early afternoon, the room had grown warm. Coffee cups sat abandoned beside stacks of paperwork. Outside, gray clouds rolled across the skyline. Ethan had barely touched the lunch placed in front of him. Damien noticed that too. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked quietly. Ethan nodded. "Just tired." The answer sounded weaker than usual. Before Damien could respond, one of the executives began presenting new financial projections. The discussion resumed. Ethan lowered his gaze toward the table. Several minutes passed. Then Damien heard it. A small cough, barely noticeable. Ethan quickly covered his mouth. Nobody reacted. A minute later it happened again, slightly stronger this time. Ethan reached for a glass of water. His hand trembled. Damien's stomach tightened. "Ethan." Ethan shook his head. "I am okay." Another cough interrupted the sentence. Then another. The room slowly fell silent. Everyone turned toward him. Ethan attempted to stand. Instead, his knees seemed to weaken beneath him. He grabbed the edge of the table for support. The coughing returned suddenly, harsher than before. Damien was already moving. He crossed the room in seconds. Ethan's face had gone completely pale. A white handkerchief appeared in his hand. He pressed it against his mouth instinctively. Then he froze. Damien froze too. The spotless fabric was no longer white. A dark red stain spread across the center. Silence crashed over the room. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Ethan stared at the handkerchief as though he had been caught doing something terrible. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he looked up at Damien. There was no anger in his eyes. No guilt. Only exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had spent far too long carrying a burden alone. Damien felt the world tilt beneath him. Every suspicion, every accusation, every theory he had built over the past 3 months shattered at once. Ethan was not hiding another person. He was not hiding money. He was not hiding betrayal. He had been hiding pain. Real pain. The kind no investigation could uncover. The kind no amount of influence could control. "How long?" Damien whispered. Ethan's lips parted slightly. For a moment it seemed he might finally answer. Instead, his eyes drifted shut and his body swayed. Damien caught him before he could fall. The room erupted into motion around them, but Damien barely heard any of it. His attention remained fixed on the stained handkerchief lying on the conference table. Because for the first time, he realized the secret he had been chasing was far more frightening than anything he had imagined. Ethan regained consciousness several hours later in a private hospital suite overlooking the city. The room was quiet except for the steady hum of medical equipment and the distant sound of rain tapping against the window. For a moment, he simply stared at the ceiling, disoriented and exhausted. Then memory returned. The meeting. The coughing. Damien. Ethan closed his eyes. The secret he had spent months protecting was no longer a secret. A soft sound near the window made him turn his head. Damien was there. He stood with his hands in his pockets, staring out at the gray skyline beyond the glass. His suit jacket was gone. His tie hung loose around his neck. He looked as though he had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. Neither spoke immediately. The silence between them felt completely different now. Not tense. Not angry. Just heavy. Ethan swallowed. "How long have you been here?" Damien did not turn around. "Since they brought you in." Ethan looked away. "You should have gone home." A bitter laugh escaped Damien. "Home?" He finally turned. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. "You collapsed in front of me, Ethan." Ethan had no response. Damien crossed the room slowly and stopped beside the hospital bed. For the first time since they had met, he seemed uncertain. Lost. "Why?" he asked quietly. Ethan knew exactly what he meant. Why hide it? Why lie? Why carry it alone? Ethan stared at the blanket covering his legs. "Because I knew what would happen." Damien frowned. "What does that mean?" Ethan took a slow breath. "You would stop everything." "Of course I would." That is exactly why I did not tell you. Damien stared at him as though he had spoken another language. Ethan continued before he could interrupt. Your entire life revolves around protecting people, solving problems, fixing impossible situations. His voice grew softer. I did not want to become another problem you needed to fix. The words struck harder than Ethan intended. Damien looked away immediately. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he reached into his coat pocket and removed a thick manila folder. Ethan's heart stopped. He recognized it instantly. The clinic logo sat printed across the front. His medical file. Damien placed it on the bedside table. The doctor gave this to me. Ethan felt cold. You read it. It was not a question. Damien nodded once. The silence that followed seemed endless. Ethan already knew what the file contained. Every test result, every scan, every specialist consultation, every warning, every prediction he had spent months pretending did not exist. Damien lowered himself into the chair beside the bed. The movement looked strangely difficult for a man who usually projected absolute confidence. I kept thinking you were hiding something from me, he admitted. Something terrible. Ethan gave a sad smile. I was. Damien shook his head immediately. No, his voice cracked. No, I was wrong. Ethan looked at him. Really looked at him. The frustration was gone. The suspicion was gone. In their place sat something far worse. Regret. Damien rubbed a hand across his face before speaking again. The report says the symptoms started almost a year ago. Ethan nodded. Yes. And you went through all of this alone. Ethan looked toward the rain outside the window. I tried. Damien followed his gaze. Neither noticed the storm beginning to clear beyond the clouds. Neither noticed the first hint of sunlight breaking across the distant skyline. Because at that moment, both men were staring at something far more frightening than the future. They were staring at the cost of everything that had remained unspoken between them for far too long. Ethan expected Damien to leave the hospital after reading the file. He expected anger, disappointment, perhaps even distance. Instead, the opposite happened. Over the next several days, Damien seemed determined to become impossible to escape. Every morning Ethan woke to find him sitting nearby with coffee in one hand and a tablet full of medical research in the other. Every afternoon, he returned from meetings carrying new information. Names of specialists, experimental treatments, clinical studies, contacts from hospitals across the country. It was as though Damien had declared war on the illness itself. Ethan found the transformation both touching and terrifying. One evening, he looked up from his hospital bed to find Damien arguing quietly on the phone near the window. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes. When it ended, Damien immediately opened another file. Ethan sighed. You have not gone home in 3 days. I am fine. Ethan almost laughed. Hearing his own favorite lie repeated back to him felt strangely unfair. Damien, I said I am fine. You are exhausted. Damien finally looked up. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes now. His normally perfect appearance had been replaced by rumpled shirts and unfinished meals. Ethan knew exactly what he was seeing. Damien was trying to carry everything alone. The same mistake Ethan had made. Come here, Ethan said softly. Damien hesitated before moving closer. Ethan reached out and took his hand. You cannot solve this by refusing to sleep. Watch me. Ethan smiled despite himself. You always think you can fix everything. Damien lowered his gaze. Not everything. The words hung between them. Ethan knew what he meant. Money could not buy certainty. Influence could not guarantee outcomes. For the first time in his life, Damien had encountered a problem that refused to obey his will. That realization seemed to haunt him. 2 days later, Ethan was discharged and allowed to return home. The penthouse felt different when they arrived. Quieter, more fragile somehow. Damien immediately transformed the guest room into a private workspace filled with medical records, treatment plans, and schedules. Specialists called throughout the day. New appointments appeared on calendars. Every possible option was explored. Yet despite all the activity, uncertainty remained. One afternoon, Ethan wandered into the office and found Damien staring at several reports spread across the desk. The room was silent except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Any good news? Ethan asked. Damien looked up slowly. For a moment, he considered pretending. Ethan could see it in his eyes. Then he shook his head. Not yet. Ethan nodded. The honesty hurt less than false hope would have. Damien stood and crossed the room. I am not giving up. Ethan smiled sadly. I know. I mean it. I know. Damien looked away toward the city skyline visible beyond the windows. For the first time since this nightmare began, he appeared genuinely helpless. Not weak. Not defeated. Simply human. Ethan walked closer and rested his hand against Damien's arm. You do not have to carry this alone anymore. Damien closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something vulnerable lingered there. Something Ethan had never seen before. Fear. Real fear. And for the first time, Ethan understood that the illness was no longer his secret burden. It belonged to both of them now. The question neither man could answer was whether sharing the weight would be enough to save them from what was coming next. The treatment began 2 weeks later. Ethan never asked Damien how many calls he had made, how many specialists he had contacted, or how many impossible doors he had forced open. He already knew the answer. All of them. Every option that existed had been explored. Every possibility had been pursued. On the morning of the procedure, the city was wrapped in pale sunlight. Spring had finally arrived. The trees lining the streets below the hospital showed hints of green, and for the first time in months, the sky was clear. Ethan stood beside the window of his hospital room, watching the world move outside. People hurried to work. Cars filled the avenues. Life continued as if nothing extraordinary was happening. Behind him, Damien sat quietly in a chair. The silence between them felt comfortable now. Honest. There were no more secrets left to carry. You keep staring at me, Ethan said softly. Damien did not deny it. I know. Ethan smiled. You are making me nervous. Good. Ethan turned toward him. Good. Damien stood and walked over. Because if you are nervous, it means you are still thinking about the future. Ethan laughed quietly. It was the first genuine laugh Damien had heard in weeks. The sound alone felt like a victory. Hours later, doctors arrived and began preparing everything. The room became busy. Instructions were reviewed. Questions were answered. Forms were signed. Through it all, Damien remained at Ethan's side. When the final moment came, Ethan reached for his hand. Damien held it immediately. Neither cared who was watching. I am sorry, Ethan whispered. Damien frowned. For what? For hiding everything. Damien shook his head. No more apologies. Ethan swallowed hard. I was afraid. I know. I thought protecting you meant carrying it alone. Damien squeezed his hand gently. And I thought loving you meant solving everything myself. Ethan smiled sadly. We are both stubborn. That might be the most accurate thing you have ever said. The tension eased for a moment. Then a nurse appeared at the door. It was time. Damien leaned forward and pressed his forehead lightly against Ethan's. Come back to me, he said. The words were simple, honest, vulnerable. Ethan nodded. I will try. The hours that followed felt endless. Damien spent them in a waiting room overlooking the city. Meetings were canceled. Calls went unanswered. The world could function without him for one day. Nothing mattered except the person behind those hospital doors. As afternoon slowly became evening, sunlight faded across the skyline. Then finally a doctor entered the room. Damien stood so quickly his chair nearly tipped backward. For several seconds neither spoke. The doctor removed his mask and smiled. A real smile. The kind that changed everything. Relief hit Damien so suddenly he almost lost his balance. The procedure had been successful. Recovery would take time. There would be follow-up treatments and difficult months ahead. Nothing was guaranteed. But hope existed now where despair had once lived. 3 months later, Ethan stood once again beside a window overlooking the city. Only this time it was the penthouse. Summer sunlight filled the room. The exhaustion was fading. The color had returned to his face. Life felt possible again. Behind him, Damien approached carrying a small velvet box. Ethan immediately laughed. You are serious? Damien nodded. Completely. After everything we have been through, this is how you are doing it. Apparently. Ethan opened the box and stared at the ring inside. Tears filled his eyes before he could stop them. Damien smiled. No contracts. No obligations. No conditions. Just one question. Ethan never let him finish. The answer arrived before the question could. And as the sun set beyond the city skyline, both men finally understood something neither illness nor fear had managed to teach them before. Love was never about carrying burdens alone. It was about surviving them together. What would you have done if you were in this situation? Tell us in the comments. If you love Alpha and Omega stories filled with passion, loyalty, heartbreak, and second chances, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story.